How we doing, fellas? I hope that everyone is fine and dandy and, most importantly, ready for another video here on Brickwave. It's no secret that I'm a LEGO Ninjago fan at the ripe age of 18, which you can tell because Ninjago's performed very well in my two previous videos. So today I thought I would go ahead and make a full video for the theme, and I've chosen to rank every villain faction in Ninjago. My rankings will account for minifigs, LEGO sets, and how they were portrayed in the show. I won't be considering things like values of the sets though, because a lot of things to consider are side builds to larger sets. And one last thing before we get into it, this will not just be the main armies, this will include the main villains as well, because they tend to be very similar to their armies for the most part. This list was super hard to make, and I know the list could change tomorrow if I thought of anything differently. Lastly, remember that this is all my opinion, so please don't. Actually, please feel free to harass me in the comments because at this stage of my YouTube career, any engagement is good engagement. Without further ado, last place is going to be the Geo Whippers at number 24, or whatever the core Wave 1 snakes are called. Cool color scheme and decent printing, but there's no new molds, and only two of them really, and they don't have their own set. The side builds they have are kinda dumb too, and when you add on that they're not in the show, you're not cooking up a recipe for success. Similarly, at 23 is the core Bone Warriors. I put them ahead mostly because they were actually in the show, even if it was just a short little cameo, and they weren't that threatening or cool when on screen. I do think their overall designs are very good though, and I like how many there are instead of just the two snakes. They also didn't have any sets, but I like their side builds more, and they came up with their own unique weapons pack that had some pretty cool parts in it. Shockingly to myself, I put the Oni at 22. I think the figures we got are cool, but there are no new pieces or print variety, and none of them have leg printing. Their designs didn't break any barriers or do anything crazy unique, especially since the Oni masks were used in cooler designs in Season 8. Their main reason for being this low is not having any sets. I think their color scheme being pretty much just black and purple had the potential for some really clean and sick looking sets, but all we got was a figure pack. It didn't help that their portrayal in the show wasn't really a standout either. For how hyped up they were during Sons of Garmadon and Hunted, they were pretty lackluster. That's pretty much only due to the fact that their season was only 4 episodes, as they definitely had their cool moments. Their designs and show representation are overall still positive to me though, and I really do like all these factions, even the ones at the bottom. At 21, I have the Day of the Departed crew, I guess? Similar to the Oni, this would have been way better if Day of the Departed was more than just a 45-minute special. I think Yang is underrated as he's really one of the more sympathetic villains in Ninjago, with his whole motive of just not wanting to be forgotten and all that, and his redemption has value to it. I do think it's a bit odd that he just became a villain, like he was kind of portrayed as neutral in Season 5 and then just decided he wanted to trap an innocent teenager in his haunted house forever just so he could be physical again. This and the fact that the other villains being brought back isn't that satisfying, and none of them feel like a real threat like they were in their respective seasons. Plus, the only build they have is Chen's Dino, which I do like, but it's small, and the minifigs, while cool, don't get any credit points because they're not new. Then, at 20, I have the Islanders from Season 14 Part 1. Yes, that's how I categorize it, fight me. Their strongest point is their design. I like the unique lavender color they have in the sets, and their transparent design in the show is absolutely awesome, although it does make the set figures seem less cool in comparison. They also have two very solid sets, although neither are incredibly standout quality, but I do like how they're unique. They're not higher up because of their show appearance. They're not actually evil inherently, which is a concept that can create potential for some incredible antagonists, but it wasn't executed very well here. They just got tricked, and a faction later in this list executed this idea much better in my opinion. For a culture that's been around for as long as they have, they really shouldn't have been fooled by such an obvious scam. I guess it's also important to say that Ronin's not a part of this faction because he didn't work with the Islanders. Coming in at 19 is the Pyro Vipers, aka Asphira's Fire Snake Legion. This faction has two extreme points, so let's talk about the very positive one first, their design. I'm really fascinated by ancient Egypt, so the fact that these guys came from pyramids and look like mummies is sweet to me. I also love the transparent orange on them, and these pieces were sick before they got reused a million times, and I think that this is still the best use of them because of the transparent parts. I also think they have a top 5 armor piece in all of Ninjago, and it fits perfectly with the snake head piece. They only have one set, but it is a darn good one. Unfortunately, that's where the fun ends. The Fire chapter of Season 11 is the only piece of Ninjago media I actually dislike, and a lot of that has to do with these guys. The whole season is treated as a joke, so the fire snakes are never taken seriously like a real threat. They're involved in great fight scenes, but that's more to credit the Wild Brain animators throughout the run than the fire snakes themselves. Asphira herself is rather annoying in Season 11. and while she's much better in Crystallized, that's not relevant to this villain faction. They have some great highs, but the lowest lows, which prevents them from having a good placement on the list. My number 18 placement has some similar flaws, and that's the Shark Army from the Ninjago movie. Although not canon, I thought they should still be here. Although they're probably the funniest group on this list, that's the only thing that they're the best at. They fail to even bother the ninja, but are also some of the only ones to beat the ninja as well, which does benefit their placement. Their sets are super overhated, even though they're still probably the worst Ninjago movie sets, and the minifigs are unique, even though they don't really feel like Ninjago. One thing that definitely boosts them is Garmadon, who's not only one of the funniest parts of the movie, but also a much better fighter than the ninja, so he's not treated like a joke either. I'm one of the few Ninjago fans who actually enjoys the movie because I can view it as its separate thing, but the villains aren't anything super special, although I definitely still like them. Coming in at 17 is the most recent group at the time of recording this video, and that's the Wolf Mask Warriors. Their original color scheme is sweet, and I like the red and purple too, although not as much, but I really like their attachments. Unfortunately, we got very little variety in the troops except for a non-canon archer. The generals are cool figs, but Jordana and Cinder share prints in the first half, and Cinder's fig kinda annoyingly uses the ghost tailpiece for part 2. I really like both versions of Roz, especially the spectacular summer version, and I think Jordana's uniform for part 2 is sick as well. Noct is also cool overall, but he wasn't in any sets and had little screen time. Like a lot of factions, they have a lack of representation in the sets. The one set they do have is a big one, and I really like it, and I guess you can say the saddle and the Source Dragon also counts, but my biggest complaint is that they were the only villains for the entire year, and we only got one set and one not so great mech. In the show, they definitely had potential, but I kinda wish they were used or explained more. The ninja only interact with the villains a couple times in part 1, and the conflict in part 2 revolves more around the tournament until the wolf masks come in the finale, which seemed a bit rushed. We also don't even know who they are, where they come from, or why they even wear wolf masks. I guess that one new book says that Noct is a wolf being of sorts, but a hint of an explanation would have been nice in the show. Loading in at 16 are the villains of Prime Empire, led by Unagami. I like all the minifig designs, the Whack Rats, Red Visors, Tsushimi, and of course Unagami himself. The printing isn't overly complicated, but they all work, even the controversial rats. I love Unagami and the Red Visor's color scheme, and that comes out in the sets as well, both of which are super underrated builds that I really like. Similarly to the wolf masks, the ninja don't interact with them as much as I'd like. They spend most of the series exploring Prime Empire and only run into the Whack Rats and Red Visors every now and then, and they're not too imposing when they encounter the ninja. What is imposing, however, is Unagami's first scene, which is probably the best scene of the season. Unagami's great when we get him, both in the cool factor and how he does work as an emotional villain in my opinion, but he only shows up to scold Okino and then in the finale. The mechanic also fits in here, and I honestly think he's pretty cool. I like how they made him into an actual challenge by basically just turning him into Doc Ock. Overall, very underrated villain faction, but it could have easily been better. At 15th, I have Imperium. I hate having both Dragon's Rising factions in the bottom half because I like the show, and I think it gets too much hate from OG Glazers, but the product designs aren't helping the case. Imperium only gets 2 mid-sized builds, and while I think the Empress mech is really good and I love the front half of the Hunter Hound, its back half is way too scrawny for me. I also really hate the Empress, but in a good way, the way you hate Umbrage or the High Evolutionary. You're meant to hate them. Roz is good, but not great during his time in Imperium. I like how you can kind of see his manipulative side in the flashbacks, but he doesn't do much else for me otherwise. And Ropton is genuinely funny to me, although he got a bit more screen time than he should have. The army is competent, but a bit too dumb in my opinion, although they also get a few good laughs out of me. I would have liked if they were overall a bit more serious to match their designs, which is the main reason they climbed decently high up the list. They're probably the most detailed figures Ninjago's made, and the new molds were sweet as well. 14th place belongs to the Blizzard Samurai from Season 11's Ice Chapter. Like the Fire Snakes, I love their designs. The new molds created for these guys are so sweet, and they work in all 3 color schemes. The transparent elements add such a sick touch to the figs, both in the ones that use samurai molds and in the rest of the faction. And this variety of figs is also something I like. They also only have 1 set, unless you count Lloyd's Journey. And while the castle is just fine, the Boreal Dragon is great, using probably the best wing pieces in the whole theme. In the show, these guys are also way better than the Fire Snakes. I think they're definitely threatening, which I always like to see, and I really like the touch that some of them are corrupted soldiers while others are pure ice made by Zane. Speaking of which, I did not see that twist coming when I first watched the season, which is probably because I turned my brain off to watch Ninjago, which you kinda have to do a lot of the time, but that doesn't change the fact that that came as a positive surprise to me. I think Vex is also a really solid overall villain, as kind of a puppet master rather than a physical opponent. I think they're good in this show, but not incredible. These guys would have been way higher if they had more sets, and if the one they had was more than just half good. Also, give me credit for never using a cool pun while talking about these guys. Fans of OG stuff and OG stuff alone are gonna have my head for this, but I'm putting the Skulkin at 13. They're led by Garmadon, but only his pilot representation counts, so pretty much before he became an interesting character or a unique minifig. The skeleton generals have some great molds, and I do really like the spiked armor piece, but a lot of the lower level skeletons are a bit basic for me. They mostly benefit by having a lot more sets than most villain factions, and while the Skull Truck is great, the rest of the vehicles are good, with the ATV being not so great, and I don't love the Dark Fortress as much as other people do. In the show, they serve their purpose as a beginner level foe for the ninja, but they only give the ninja trouble when they're in their vehicles or attacking them while they sleep. I sound like I'm hating, but I promise I really do like the general minifigs and most of the sets, and I do definitely like them in the show, which is why they're still in a decent spot. Coming from one of the most beloved villain factions to one of the most hated, I have the Vermilion at 12, and I'm including the Hands of Time as well, even though they're obviously a different species and all that. I know a lot of people don't like them or Season 7 at all, but I personally enjoy both of those things. I think the Vermilion as a concept, although repetitive, fit perfectly in Ninjago. The land clearly has a snake problem, and then being able to turn any conglomeration of metal into a war machine is really cool. People don't like their sets, but I think they're all solid, with the Iron Doom being a standout due to its silhouette alone. It doesn't hurt then that these are some of the most detailed minifigs ever. The coiling snakes and shiny metal surprisingly work, and so does the hint of bronze as well. The generals have pretty cool helmets and armor pieces, and the Time Twins have super complex yet clean designs. You know, there's a reason they're some of the most expensive Ninjago figs today. In the show, I love the lore about how their elemental masters fallen from grace, and while Blunk and Bragmonk are annoying at times, I don't hate them as much as most others. Acronix and Crux are fun in the show, and I like how the Vermilion are used as a resource just as much as they are an army, but they're kind of just a generic force outside of that. Just barely missing out of the top 10 is the Army of the Endless Sea at number 11. Like a lot of villains in recent years, their representation in the sets is great in quality but lacking in quantity. We only get 2 versions of the Mare Guards and Kalmar, and even though they have good printing and Kalmar has some sweet new molds, I feel like there just straight up should be more. They also only have 1 set and 1 side build to represent themselves, and while the set is cool with a great color scheme, I feel like either a full temple or, even better, a full Wojira would have been a much better choice for the set. So why are they almost top 10? Simple. I think they're amazing in Season 14 Part 2. Again, fight me. The guards are sufficient, and I like the one scene with Benthamar where you kind of get the sense they're not bad people, they just kinda got brainwashed by Kalmar, who obviously carries them to this spot. He is easily the best Wild Brain villain, and no one's come near him since. He's one of the most maniacal and insane opponents the ninja have had to face, while not quite reaching the point where he's evil just for the sake of being evil, and he's got some real personality to him too. Plus, if you include Wojira in the villain faction, then they become even better, and they easily had the coolest and most unique takeover of Ninjago City when they flooded the whole place. Reaching the top 10 is a faction that's pretty similar to the Seabound foes, but have some definite upgrades, and that's the Awakened Warriors of Season 11, led by the Skull Sorcerer. I like their designs, but like the Mare Guards, I wish there was more versions of them. This is a problem because the Geckos and Munts were portrayed as villains in the sets, so the real villains were only found in the 2 biggest sets. The Skull Sorcerer himself is also a great minifig, with a sweet head mold that looks smoother and better than in the show in my opinion, and the green on the robes really stands out. There are only 2, maybe 3 sets for these guys, but they're phenomenal and both blow the Seabound Temple out of the water. Yeah, you thought you could escape without a pun? Both Griefbringer and the Dungeons are probably top 5 villain sets of all time. In the show, the army's more of an annoyance rather than a threat, but they definitely get the job done, and the Skull Sorcerer, while a bit basic in character, is perfect for Cole's development this season. Since they have great sets and good show representation, their overall solid display earns them a top 10 spot. Another one of my hottest takes comes in at number 9, where I have the Overlord's Crystallized faction. In terms of minifigs, this is probably the Overlord's best group, although not by much. The Warriors are, to put it formally, flippin' radical, dude, even though I would have liked to see more with the armor piece. And they didn't need much more variety because of all the general minifigs, which all have very good printing, even though they share the same torso for the most part. And a lot of people's complaints about the Crystallized season starts with them, not the soldiers. I agree that more should have have been done with the Crystal Council, but as you can probably guess, I don't have nearly as much of an issue with Harumi or the Overlord as other people do. Most people complain that Harumi's death was unredeemed and crystallized because she just became evil again, but I don't think she did. There's one scene when she's talking with Lloyd and she seems sympathetic, but then her eyes turn pink and she becomes rageful again, which suggests to me that she's under some form of mind control from the Overlord. It's kind of a cheap cop-out to be fair, but it definitely means that she keeps her redemption, at least to me. And while I think it was also kind of cheap and easy to bring back the Overlord, I think they actually improved upon him by giving him a reason for his evil with the whole peace in the dark thing. In terms of sets, they both definitely have their flaws, but the transparent pink makes them both really good overall. Going from one of the most hated seasons of Ninjago, let's do something at least a little bit easier at number 8, the Stone Warriors from season 2, led by Garmadon and the Overlord again. I know people do see a lot of flaws in this season, but it's a lot less hated than Crystallized. This was the first army that actually seemed like a real competent threat, and although the indestructible concept came up a couple more times, this was the first one, so get some points there. The minifigs aren't incredible, but they're very, very cool, and are perfectly cohesive together, even though I do wish we get a metamorphosis version of Garmadon as a fig. Like the Vermilion, a lot of people hate on these sets, but I've always liked them, especially if you include the builds from Legacy. They're not spectacular and the color scheme is nothing special, but I'm always happy when I see the ones I have on my shelf. In the show, the main thing they do right is by not being an easy opponent, which I already mentioned, but I also think the story with them is compelling. Garmadon resists fighting his son for the whole season, and while the Overlord taking over him does take a bit away from the emotions of the final battle, that last episode is still iconic. Along with Seabound, this was one of the best takeovers of Ninjago City, as it really does seem hopeless, and the Overlord Dragon on top of the building absolutely has what kids these days call aura. Next up at lucky number 7, I have the Nindroids. Wow, I didn't even realize that I had all of the Overlord forces in a row here. That seems kinda lazy by me, but I swear it wasn't intentional. I think the Nindroid minifigs are very menacing with the black, purple, and silver color scheme, and the splash of trans red in their weapons and vehicles complements the vibe very well. Cryptor also has a sweet armor plate, and this is by far the best Overlord minifigure. Man, I wish I owned one. Not to mention, our only Cyrus Borg for 9 years. Some of their vehicles aren't anything special, but I appreciate that there are a decent amount of them, and I think the Destructoid is underrated, and the Mech Dragon and Overlord Walker are excellent. In the show, they're another army that actually challenges the ninja, which I like because it doesn't always happen. I mean, the main villain usually does, but the regular foot soldiers are kinda like pawns a lot of the time. I also think it's cool that they're all essentially upgraded versions of Zane. Just adds an extra touch. Coming in at number 6, I have Master Chen and his Anacondrae cultists. Not gonna lie, these guys are carried by Chen and Klaus. Chen's minifigure perfectly encapsulates his crazy yet rich and extravagant self, and that helmet crown thing is iconic and epic. Klaus's minifig isn't super interesting, but he's arguably the best villain character in season 4, and I love how he always seems kinda pissed at Chen, but still goes along with him. Kinda hints that he hoped to overthrow him one day. I think the rest of his forces aren't super intriguing, and I'm mixed on the fact that they're just humans. On the one hand, it's the first time that the ninja face regular people rather than creatures or other beings, so it adds a bit more realism to the story because you think, these guys all have a reason for being on this side. And the minifigs do get cooler once they turn into Anacondrae, but I for some reason always found it hard to believe when the ninja would have similar difficulty fighting average Joes as they do when fighting killer robots. But like I said earlier, I also don't like it when the army is too easy to beat, so that's more of a fault on me. I like how their plan is kept a mystery for a little bit, and everything about Chen consistently works to portray him as a mastermind. He's able to manipulate both sides of a war, run an insanely successful company from a stranded island, find a network of followers while still being on the island, orchestrate a tournament that convinces the realm's top heroes to join while keeping it a secret from authorities, and ultimately his plan succeeds in the end. You'll notice I haven't talked about the sets yet, and that's because they're just kind of there. Probably the most boring of all the villain set lines, even though they're all still solid. We also don't get much of why Chen is evil, but this is one of the most entertaining and memorable villain factions for sure. Making their way into the top 5 is the Dragon Hunters from season 9. Remember how I said the Islanders were just a worse version of another faction? Yeah, this is them. Except instead of getting tricked by an obviously wooden lizard, the hunters got tricked by an expert manipulator who knows how to use fear systematically to obtain his needs. Iron Baron isn't a super deep character outside of just being selfish, but that leads to the most satisfying comeuppance in the whole series. Plus, because of this, we really sympathize with the hunters and learn more about them as a people. They're also not inherently evil, but it actually pays off here, as you really see them feel the weight of their actions due to being tricked, and they give a really strong reaction to it instead of just kind of nervously saying sorry. Faith is a great character, and she actually addresses sexism, which is a topic that's more controversial and real than a lot of the other surface level lessons the ninja learn. Other than that, the individual hunters aren't super interesting, but this faction ends up better than Chen's cult because of the sets, and the helicopter side build isn't bad. The minifigs are similar to Chen's as well, when there are some great ones, but most are kind of just alright, but their sets are sweet. They ended up getting the two biggest sets of the wave just like the Awakened Warriors, and both are phenomenal. The Diesel Knot has such a unique Mad Max vibe, and it genuinely seems dangerous, and the Dragon Pit has a ton of great play features and provides a really solid base for the hunters. Overall, great group, and I hope we can see them again if we ever see the first realm in Dragons Rising. My number 4 pick is going to be Season 6's Sky Pirates. I think these guys are really similar to the Hunters. The minifigs are pretty cool, with a couple standouts, including Ninjago's first big fig in Dogshank, and I've always loved Doubloon, even if there's no crazy parts on him or anything. Interestingly enough, I think all of the villain sets are just kind of B tier, with the Misfortunes Keep maybe creeping up to A tier, but their show representation far and away is what lands them this spot. First off, Nadakon is my favorite villain in the show. He's the best mastermind the ninja face, even if the writers forgot to let him know that he could just strike people with the Sword of Souls. No one ever beat him in combat, his design is perfect for his character, and the voice acting for him is probably top 5 in the series. He kinda just wants to chill and live his life with his crew, but then is driven mad by revenge, and has one of the most unique plans out of anyone. But what makes this faction even better is the crew. I think this season has the ninja actually interacting with the villains in ways other than fighting more than any other, at least after they escape prison. Because of this, the audience knows them personally as characters and not just enemies, and even the ninja form relationships with the pirates. This means that some of the crew, particularly Clancy, Flintlock, and Dogshank, actually go through mini character arcs through the season, as they finally realize a life of piracy probably isn't the way to go when they see how corrupt their captain is. I don't think I can think of another season where the villains are as meaningful to the story as they are in Skybound, not as plot devices or sources of conflict, but as actual characters. Slithering into number 3 are the Serpentine, which I would imagine is a lot of people's first place villain faction. They're easily the most iconic villains, I think, but I tried not to let nostalgia blind me, as I do think they genuinely deserve to be here anyway. Like the Skulkin, they benefit by simply having a lot more than most villain factions. There are 17 unique Serpentine minifigs, and they're all really cool with some amazing molds. I like how there are 4 distinct tiers, and every tribe has 1 member per tier except for the Anacondrae. Similarly, they had a lot of sets, but unlike the Skulkin, most of the sets aren't good, but great. Outside of the janky mech, the Bite Cycle, Fangpire Truck, and Fangpire Wrecking Ball are all excellent builds that could easily be released today. Plus, I've always liked the Great Devourer build too. The main reason they're not at number 1 is because they have consistent highs, but the highs aren't as good as the top 2, and also because these guys are definitely not super difficult fighting threats in the show. That isn't to say that the Serpentine are portrayed badly in the show overall though, as Pythor and Seals are both iconic characters that were good enough to stick around for over a decade on the show. And of course, Garmadon becomes one of the show's best characters as their leader in the sets and Serpentine leader in season 2. But number 2 is even better than the Serpentine, and that's the Sons of Garmadon from seasons 8 and 9. First off, let me just say that the detailing on these minifigs is superb, especially on the higher ranking members. I wasn't expecting bikers to have such exceptional designs, but kudos to the designers. Speaking of which, season 8 is pretty much the epitome of bad idea, impeccable execution. Using the movie designs was controversial, and bringing back Garmadon could have been disastrous, but ended up being great decisions for the show moving forward due to how it played out. And relevant to the point I'm making, I was so skeptical of bikers being the villains when it was first revealed. Like Chen's cult, I was like, no way regular humans actually give the ninja a hard time, because again, they're just regular people. But then it did make sense because they were led by a robot, and all they needed was one Oni mask to become really formidable, and then it just spiraled from there. Plus, turns out they weren't just a biker gang, they were a fully fledged crime syndicate run secretly by someone in royalty. Speaking of which, the other main reason the ninja lost, that's right, they actually fully lost, was because the team leader was ruined from the inside out by Harumi, who was executed perfectly in seasons 8 and 9. I love how the threat of the SOG just got exponentially bigger and bigger as the season progressed, as they got more Oni masks, resurrected Garmadon in his only evil side, which created a great new take on the character as well as a really graphic minifig, and then building the Oni Titan, which although not a great set, ended up being the most difficult force the ninja had to face up at that point, in addition to all the other things they've stacked up. Oh, and I should probably mention the rest of the sets before I forget, because I've been railing about these guys for way too long. They all fall in between good and great, so while they don't match the quality of the minifigs or the show counterpart, they don't add or detract from the villain faction. But even after I gushed about the SOG for too long there, I still have an even better faction at number 1, and that is the Ghosts from Season 5. Honestly, I only talked about the Sons of Garmadon for so long because they really surprised me, but I knew the Ghosts were going to be A1 from day one. I've already said that I love transparent Lego pieces, and while transparent neon yellow-green is far from my favorite transparent color, I think it goes so well with the dark blue, spring green, and hints of purple and red. In fact, I'd argue that the Ghosts have the best color scheme out of any villain faction, which is probably the main reason I put them at the top, because I tend to like the sets a little more than the show. Like the two OG baddies, the Ghosts came in a huge wave of sets, so there are a ton of minifigs. I think the basic soldiers are more than solid, and I really like the Ghost hood piece. The generals are also fantastic when they use the Ghost tail or the transparent legs, and Moro has a sick torso print, but isn't a super standout fig, but I honestly kinda like that about him. He's just a teenager whose raw ambition led him to the top of the leaderboards, so it makes sense that he won't look as deluxe as the rest of everyone else. Not to mention how the Evil Green Ninja is one of the best villain minifigs of all time with that sick specialized hood. In terms of the sets, I really like how there's kind of a dragon theme. There are a total of 4 ghost dragons, 5 if you count the polybag, and they're all really well done, especially the Moro dragon, which still has the best head out of any Ninjago dragon in my opinion. The vehicles they have are also great, with the chain cycle being probably my favorite Ninjago bike, and the Mechenstein is such a great concept, and it's different enough from the original Samurai Mech to make it a really standout build. With all that, the Ghosts really just had to be okay in the show to make it top 5, but they were great. I love how confident Moro is, like he was so sure that he would have been the Green Ninja that he went and attacked Lloyd by himself and won, and then again when they were fighting for the Realm Crystal. I also really like how the Ghosts weren't unbeatable, the ninja just didn't have the specific skill needed to beat them, which is a great balance of the issue I talked about a couple times in this video. Side note, I think the idea of water being the Ghost kryptonite was an excellent idea, and it makes a lot of sense when they explain it in the show. The finale also feels really climactic, even more than most seasons' conclusions, because the Ghosts were so good that they got a 2-episode finale, where we were introduced to the Preeminent. I don't think the final part of the battle was the most incredible, but it's still definitely top 10. Moro's redemption did seem kinda just thrown in there, but it weirdly still worked. Overall, the Ghosts topped the list because there's not a single category they don't excel in. Wow, this video ended up being way longer than I thought it would be. With that being said, thank you all so much for watching the video. It means so much to me that you are willing to hear my voice yap about my terrible opinions for way too long. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your week, fellas, and I will see you later. Au revoir.